Have you ever just stopped and thought, is any of this real? You know, that nagging feeling that something's just off? Well, you're definitely not the only one. Today, we are diving headfirst into one of the most mind-bending ideas out there in both science and philosophy. We're talking about simulation theory. You know this line. It's so much more than just a movie quote now, right? It's become this cultural shorthand for questioning everything, for pulling back the curtain on what we think is reality. So the question is, are you ready to see just how deep this rabbit hole really goes? All right, so a glitch in the matrix. I mean, where do you even start with an idea this huge? I think the best way in, the most relatable way, is to think about it like a video game. Let's just run with this idea for a minute. What if our entire universe is just a ridiculously advanced, unbelievably complex game? I mean, really think about it. The Big Bang, what if that was just the moment someone flipped the power switch on? And all those laws of physics, gravity, the speed of light, all that stuff that governs everything, well, that's just the game's physics engine. It is a completely wild thought, for sure. But could it actually be plausible? And when you start comparing them side by side, the parallels are kind of striking. You've got game designers like Jesse Schell who've pointed this out. Just like a video game has its programmed rules, our world has the laws of physics. But here's the kicker. The sheer amount of computing power you'd need to simulate our world perfectly, wow, it would be absolutely staggering. And this is where the challenge just becomes monumental. We're not just talking about programming a flat 2D screen. No. You'd have to program actual 3D space. You'd have to perfectly, flawlessly simulate all 5 of our senses, render every single molecule in the air, and on top of all that, somehow simulate 7 billion individual consciousnesses, all talking and thinking and interacting at once. Oh, and you'd even have to create a virtual reality, our dreams, inside the main virtual reality. The complexity is it's almost impossible to even wrap your head around. But here's the twist. Programmers of video games, they're smart. They use all these clever shortcuts to save processing power. For example, they only render stuff in high detail that the player is actually looking at. Everything else is kind of blurry or low res. So what if our creators are doing the same thing? What if the world only pops into full high-definition detail when you're paying attention to it? And that leads to a pretty unnerving question, doesn't it? Are you the only active player here? Okay, so this whole idea of a rendered reality, it kind of leads us to an even deeper question. Because before we can even begin to trust what we see out there, we got to ask ourselves, can we even trust the one and only tool we have to perceive it all? Can we trust our own brain? See, here's the really crucial thing to understand. Your brain isn't just a passive camera, just recording what's happening. No way. It's an active interpreter. It's a storyteller. It grabs all this raw sensory data, and it literally builds the story that we call reality. And just like any storyteller, it can get things wrong. And magicians? Oh, they are absolute masters at exploiting this. Think about it. When a rabbit is partly hidden from your view, your brain doesn't just see a void. It automatically fills in the blanks, right? It just assumes the rest of the rabbit is still there. This little mental shortcut, it's called a modal completion. And it's exactly how magicians trick us into seeing things that aren't actually there. Or, check this out, the McGurk effect. If you watch a video of someone's mouth making the shape for the sound fa, but the audio that's actually playing is the sound ba, your brain gets confused. It splits the difference and you will swear you heard fa. It's incredible. Your sense of sight literally overwrites what you're hearing. It just goes to show our perception isn't a hard fact. It's more like a constant negotiation. And really, all of this points to a fundamental truth about our own biology. Evolution never had any reason to design us to see objective, capital T, truth reality. Nope. It designed us to survive. Our senses are basically like a limited spotlight, just showing us the tiny slice of reality we need to see to find food, avoid getting eaten, and pass on our genes. Everything else? It's just noise. Okay, so if we can't fully trust our own senses, where do we look? Well, we have to look for hard evidence in the very fabric of the universe itself. Is there some kind of signature left behind by a programmer? Can we actually find the source code? This brings us to the computer scientist, Jürgen Schmidhuber, who has this really fascinating theory. He argues that maybe a simulated universe isn't so impossibly complex after all. if its foundation is built on data compression. You know, the art of taking huge amounts of information and representing it with very, very simple rules. And as Schmidhuber himself says, we actually see this principle everywhere. Think about the number pi. Its digits go on forever, never repeating, seemingly random, but they can all be generated by a surprisingly short computer program. Or look at those stunning, infinitely complex fractal landscapes you see generated by computers. Those are often created with just a few simple lines of repeating code. The takeaway is huge. Simple rules can generate almost infinite complexity. But this isn't just a cool theory. This is where things get, well, really strange. Physicist Jim Gates, he was deep in the weeds, working on the ridiculously complex math of string theory, when he just stumbled upon something totally unexpected, something that looked eerily familiar. So, to get what he found, you first need to understand something called error-correcting codes. You use them every single day. They're basically little bits of programming that make your web browser work. They're constantly checking for and fixing errors in the data that's being sent and received, just to make sure everything is stable and not all corrupted. Okay, get this. Gates discovered these exact same types of error-correcting codes, but they were hidden deep within the fundamental equations of supersymmetry, the equations that describe the very nature of our reality. It's as if the universe has its own debugging software running in the background, just making sure the whole simulation doesn't crash. So, shadows on the wall. What in the world does all of this imply? I mean, if we really are living inside some kind of code, what does that mean for things like space and time, and even our own consciousness? Well, one of the most truly mind-bending theories out there is called the holographic principle, and it suggests that this three-dimensional reality we all experience, it might be nothing more than a projection, like a hologram. All the information that makes up our 3D world could actually be stored on a distant, flat, two-dimensional surface. And you know what's crazy? This isn't even a new idea. It totally echoes Plato's famous allegory of the cave from over 2,000 years ago. He imagined these prisoners, chained up, who could only ever see shadows dancing on a wall. For them, those shadows were reality. They had no idea about the rich, three-dimensional world that was casting them. So, what if we are those prisoners? And what about us? What about our consciousness? Well, some physicists, like Hameroff and Penrose, have proposed that what we call a soul, it might actually be quantum information, stored in these tiny little structures inside our brain cells called microtubules. And they argue this information is entangled with the fabric of the universe itself, which means, theoretically, it could exist even outside our physical bodies. All right, what if it's all true? Then what now? We've looked at the evidence, the weird glitches, the potential for code buried in the laws of physics. So let's get to the final big questions. If this is a simulation, who built it? And what on earth are we supposed to do with that knowledge? Well, the leading theory is actually surprisingly personal. The philosopher Nick Bostrom argues that the programmers probably aren't aliens or some kind of gods. He thinks they're our own distant descendants, super evolved post-humans with unimaginable computing power, running what he calls ancestor simulations just to study their own past. We could literally be living inside a historical reenactment. And don't just write this off as some fringe philosophy either. Based on some pretty serious probability arguments, some thinkers have calculated the odds that we're living in a simulation to be as high as 1 in 20. Think about that. That's a 5% chance that everything you think you know is a total construct. But here's maybe the most important takeaway of all. Even if this is a simulation, does it actually matter? As long as the simulation is consistent, as long as our actions still have consequences and causes have effects, then for all intents and purposes, this reality is the only one we've got. The dream cake still tastes great. So I'm going to leave you with this one final thought to chew on. If everything you experience, love, heartbreak, joy, discovery, if all of that is just the output of an incredibly sophisticated program, does that make it any less meaningful? Does it make it any less real to you? That's the real question, isn't it?